I'll put this up on YouTube. This will have pretty much everything that you'll need in order to complete this project between all these videos. So here we go. So a couple of things that we have left to talk about. So when you're looking at things essentially evolving, all right, organisms need to have some sort of isolation, okay? And so when we look at reproductive isolation, okay, this is essentially just keeping two species from reproducing, okay? And so this is where we look at, this is kind of one of the ways that we really determine what two different species are, because for the most part, things that are in two different species, okay, do not reproduce with one another, okay? And there are two different types of reproductive isolation. We can look at pre-zygotic isolation. Okay, so pre-zygotic isolation, this is going to be things pre-zygotic, so this means before there is a zygote. Okay, this is where species who can reproduce and live in the same area do not reproduce. Okay, and so these would be things like the eastern and western meadowlark in the United States, okay? They live in the same place, and they can reproduce, but due to having completely different mating songs, okay? So they give out a song when they are in their mating season. So they have two completely different mating songs. Females of one species are not interested in males of other species. Okay, so just completely due to the fact that they have these different mating songs, this results in there being absolutely no reproduction between the two sets of organisms. Okay, so even though
I have a question.
Go ahead, Bailey.
Well, like, what if there's like two different species and like there's one with a very similar, like it's very similar but like just a tad bit different, but like you can't really tell the difference. So there's one with like a different like song, but it's very similar to the other. So like, what would happen there?
Are you talking about it's similar in the fact that we think it's similar, or that the animals think it's similar?
The animals think it's similar.
Okay, well then that could result in some sort of potential crossbreeding, but generally, even if there's only slight differences, and these organisms have been obviously brought up and evolved over time to hear those very slight differences. So it just kind of depends. But I guess that's a good way to segue into the next one. So if things do end up mating, two different species do end up mating, okay, that's called post-zygotic isolation. Okay, and so this is if two species have mated and they do live in the same area, you're going to get this post-zygotic isolation, okay? So this will be species who live in same area if reproduction is attempted, one of two things will happen. Okay, so one of two things will happen if two different organisms who are not really able to reproduce with one another, one of two things will happen. The first is embryo will not make it to term. Okay, so essentially, it's just impossible for them to have any sort of baby, and so the embryo will get washed out as per usual when the organism goes into its menstrual cycle. Okay, so that's one thing that can happen. The other thing that happens, and this would be something that you guys are potentially more. So what happens if a horse and a donkey uh, reproduce?
It makes like a mule or something.
It does make a mule, all right? And so that's where we have two different species, and they do make, offspring, okay? But what can't mules do? Or generally, what can't mules do?
I don't think
Can't
they
have babies.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay? So that's exactly right, Max. The second thing that can happen is offspring will be reproduced, but offspring is sterile. Okay, so that means horse and a donkey can make a mule. Mules cannot generally have offspring. I think once in a while there are mules that are reproductively successful, but very, very rare. Same thing with lions and tigers. Okay, you guys have all heard of a liger, I'm sure. It's a real thing. Okay, they can reproduce. However, ligers cannot. Okay, so once the lion and the tiger have produced the ligers are sterile. Okay,
Why
so
do they become sterile?
it's just something. It's kind of like having a big genetic defect. Okay, so when we talked about all those other genetic problems that people can have, or organisms can have, whether it was things like multiple sclerosis or stuff like that, you're just genetic defects. When you're trying to combine two different sets of species DNA in an embryo, you're going to get all sorts of genetic defects. And one of the most common genetic defects, the one that happens pretty much every time that it does make it to term, is that the organism becomes sterile.
So like what's the worst that can happen in like a defect?
Dying.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean things that result in death or things that result in like, obviously death would be the worst thing that you could think of, but like you could have something that makes it essentially really debilitating for a while and then you die after like a year. I don't know. There's lots of not really super great things. But with these organisms, generally that's what's going to happen is you're going to have one of these two things will happen is either you have prezygotic where they just kind of stay away from each other, or postzygotic where after they've tried to reproduce, either their offspring is sterile or just doesn't really make it. Okay. Are there any questions about that? Okay, so we've only got like two things left to talk about. So am I good to clear this? Is there anybody who's currently looking at it? Cool, I will clear it then. All right, so next thing I want to talk about is speciation. Okay, and so speciation is really just going to be where it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. One organism moves in a direction, usually the direction being using disruptive selection to make two new species. Okay, so remember there was those selections. There's the stabilizing selection, which brings everything to the middle. Directional will move it towards one extreme, and then disruptive, it's kind of got the two humps on either end of the extremes. Okay, so you're moving towards one way or the other. all of those generally um, will result in some form of speciation there, okay? Now, there are two types of speciation. One that we're most common with probably is going to be called allopatric speciation, okay? And this is going to be formation of species due to a physical barrier forming, okay? So what probably a good example of this is going to be down by the Grand Canyon, okay? There are two species of squirrels, okay? Um, there's the Abert squirrels and the Kayabob squirrels, okay? And these two things look relatively similar. There are some differences, and there have been genetic tests done. They are two different species. The only real difference is one lives on one side of the Grand Canyon and one lives on the other, okay? So as the Grand Canyon formed, it formed this physical barrier. And there used to be one species of squirrel. But over time, you started to have different selective pressures on either side of the Grand Canyon, okay? And so as these different selective pressures happen for both of these species, over time, due to this physical barrier forming, these one squirrels that have certain selective pressures will form into those Abert squirrels, and on the other side where they have the other pressures, you're going to form these Kayabob squirrels, okay? Um, and so that's kind of like the big main one that I think people are pretty obviously, they understand allopatric's speciation. When you get some sort of valley or gulch, or if a mountain forms or something like that, if there's some sort of barrier that is produced, it will cause generally two different species to form on either side of the barrier. Okay? Any question about speciation or allopatric speciation? So allopatric, they are in two different areas due to a barrier forming. Okay, and then the other one we have is sympatric speciation. Okay, and so this is going to be a little bit different. Obviously, sympatric speciation is going to be where one species becomes two while still living in same area, okay? So essentially this is where you're going to have side by side evolution, speciation, where, yep, just like I said up top, where one species becomes two, okay? And this one's a little bit harder, but essentially just kind of think about if you have, again, kind of imagine you have a situation where you either have, like, let's think about the finches, okay? The finches that we looked at down at the Galapagos, their beaks, there were certain finches that had really long, skinny beaks that were used almost like a needle to get things out. And then other ones that had short, fat beaks that were used to crush seed husks, okay, to open up a seed. So with sympatric, kind of what you can imagine is that obviously there's going to be some finches in a community that have longer, more needle-like beaks, and some that are going to have shorter, fatter beaks, okay? If all of a sudden the only two things you have in this community are going to be seeds that need to be broken up, or seeds that need you to essentially scoop it out with like the needle beak, okay? You're going to have selective pressures pulling towards one way or the other in the same area, okay? There's no physical barrier, so no physical barrier, but there are selective pressures for both extremes in a species, okay? So you're going to have one move towards one extreme, one move towards the other, until they become eventually two completely different species, okay? Are there any questions about speciation so far? Because we're really close to done, so I want to make sure if you have questions to ask them. Okay. So then we just have two things here. So we have the rate of speciation. Okay. So there's two kind of theories that we have on the rate of speciation. So this is how quickly, slowly they or species diverge and become new species. Okay, and so the two kind of theories here are you're going to have one, gradualism. Okay, and so this is going to be two species start out with a common ancestor, but over time they make small gradual changes until eventually are different enough to be two new species. Okay, so this is just kind of small changes over time, da 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 da. You're going to see this with a lot of, especially larger mammal organisms. You can think of like, well, humans, for instance, have pretty good evidence of gradualism. Things change over time. You guys can also look at things like a giraffe and an okapi, if you know what an okapi is. But giraffes and okapis share a common ancestor, and there's fossil evidence to show that there's just been slight changes over time.
I got a question.
Go for it, Bailey.
Like, what about like rats? Because like all throughout history, I've seen them looking the same, and like they reproduce like crazy. Like, there has to be like one rat that like went through like a little genetic mutation that like would have changed the whole rat species, but they all just look the same over time. Why is that?
So there are some different species of rats currently, obviously, um, and they all did evolve from some sort of common ancestor. Okay. However, at one point there was obviously some, and what you have to go back and kind of look back further is not necessarily just compare rats to rats, because all rats do share this common rat ancestor, I guess, if you want to talk about it like that. However, if you go back even further, you can look at all rodents pretty much share a common ancestor, okay? And so you have to look back further and see where's the difference between, you know, a mouse and a rat, which are pretty similar, but obviously are not the exact same thing.
So there's like a small connection between like a rat and a hamster or something.
All rodents, yes, absolutely. And we'll talk about that. That'll probably be the next thing we talk about, where we go through like kingdom, phylum, order, gene, all that sorts of stuff. And we can talk about how closely related two things are. And so, you know, rats and hamsters, or gerbils, or guinea pigs, rabbits, rodents of all sorts, and rodents of all sorts are related. Okay, rats do all types of rats comes from some common ancestor from not too long ago, and have been making slight changes where we have speciation there. But then you can have other types of speciation earlier on where you're getting two completely different things, so like a hamster and a rat. Yeah, does that kind of help? I don't know.
Yeah. So like is it also the same thing with dogs and how like they got like physically like changed to look like different like
Kind of, but that was more rats, obviously. I mean, humans have changed rats some, because I guess some people like rats, but really the only reason that dogs change at all is because humans are artificially selecting for traits.
Neat.
Okay. So anyway, the other type of rate of speciation, so you have gradualism, where they're slowly making changes. But you can see some things like snails throughout history, okay? And these are going to have things that we call punctuated equilibrium. 2 L's in equilibrium, 1 L in equilibrium. Okay, and so punctuated equilibrium is where organisms remain similar for long periods of time in fossil record and make jumps, large jumps, in appearance of two species over periods of time. Okay, and so like when I was talking about with snails, or a lot of like hard-shelled smaller organisms like that, you can kind of see throughout the fossil record that there was this pretty similar appearance for a really long time, really long time, really long time, and then all of a sudden, at about 100,000 years, they make this jump to become a completely different looking organism. Okay, and eventually you're just going to have these two jumps. All right, and they keep jumping away from each other. That's what punctuated equilibrium is. It's not like this gradual thing that kind of goes up. It's more like instead of a ramp, okay, ramps would be gradual. Think of it like stairs, where you go up and then come over, go up, come over, okay? So it's two different things. And I can go ahead and clear this and kind of, okay, so gradual equilibrium, it's just over time, gonna consistently go up, make small changes, small changes, small changes. The punctuated equilibrium, it's gonna go make a big change, then it's gonna be normal for a while, make a big change, go over for a while, make a big change, go over for a while, remain constant, okay? So every time it goes up on the stair step, so right here, that's going to be where there's going to be something new that changes. But in these periods where it's, relatively flat, we'll look at this one, this is my flattest one. This is where it's remaining constant throughout the fossil record. And then jump, okay, until we have two completely different species. Same things are essentially happening. This one just happens slower and more gradually over time. And this one just has, like I said, the small jumps, okay? So this one over here, gradualism. This one, punctuated equilibrium. All right? Okay. So what I am going to do is I'm going to start telling you guys what your project is, okay? I'm just going to kind of go over it. That way you guys will have heard it from me. But then you can obviously look at the email that I'll send out, okay? But so this will be due Friday the 24th of April by 3 p.m., okay? So students will need to create a story where they are following how a species evolved and became something different, okay? And so you can do this. I came up with 3 ways, but if you can think of a better way that you want to, so you can do this in a story. So you can essentially write me like a paper, but the paper is not like a normal scientific paper. You're essentially writing it. There are obviously scientific aspects that you're using, but you're telling the story kind of like you would in English, like a short story of how one species changed over time and evolved, or how it changed and became 2 separate species, okay?
So how like fictional can this story be?
It can be as fictional as you want it to be, as long as you're using, as long as you follow the 3 things that I put down here, and I'll get to those in a
All
second.
right, got it.
Okay, so you can tell a story. You can draw some sort of diagram. So whether you want to do like one big diagram, or if you want to do like a comic strip where you have little sequential parts, okay, And you can either just take a picture of that and email the picture to me, or you can turn that into the school and I can pick that up on Friday. Or the third thing that I kind of came up with, if you're having trouble with either of those, you can just kind of make some sort of basic presentation. All right. And if you want to do something else, like, I don't know, I know Bailey, you're relatively artsy. If you wanted to do some sort of thing there where you had a, better imagination than I do in terms of something you might do, you can obviously think of something else. You just need to check it with me if it's not one of those three things. Okay. But the three things that you're going to need to do when you're talking about your species, and this is going through all of the evolutionary stuff that we've gone over the past couple weeks. So you're going to need to talk about what changes have been made in your species over time. So you're going to need to talk about their new alleles that one species has. So how has the allele frequency changed? What are the new alleles? How does this organism look different? Or you can talk about how the two new species are different from each other and how they are both related to a common ancestor and why. Okay, so that's one thing. You'll need to talk about what mechanisms of evolution cause this to happen. Okay, and so remember, that's genetic drift, gene flow, non-random mating, random mutations, and natural selection. You can honestly use all five at once. Generally, some form of all five at once happens, but you will need to talk about which mechanisms are causing evolution to occur, and you'll need to talk about those in a little bit of detail. And then you'll need to discuss any and all evidence that you have to support that evolution has occurred in your population. And so this can be any of the types of pieces of evidence we discussed: fossil record, comparative anatomy, biogeography, comparing their genetics, all those sorts of things. All right. The more detailed that this is, the better grade you're going to get. Okay. Again, I understand that, we're really only supposed to give about 3 hours of work, and that's including these Zoom meetings. Okay. 3 hours of work per week. On Wednesday, I will open up a Zoom meeting. You do not have to be there, but I would kind of like you guys to either check in via the Zoom meeting or check in on an email, just telling me how you're doing if you have any questions on Wednesday. That way I can try and just kind of keep tabs and see who's working on this and who isn't. But yeah, I expect this to be roughly about 2 hours worth of work, okay? Due to the fact that this Zoom meeting is about an hour and we're supposed to allocate 3 hours of work to you. So I expect this to be about 2 hours worth of good work. I think a lot of you should be able to, I expect you guys to turn in something pretty decent for this. We spent quite a bit of time. I've got the different videos that I've put up. All those videos you guys can use. You guys can also use things from the internet. If you use something that's not on one of the videos or from your book, please do cite it somewhere. But anyway, so I'll shoot over that prompt to you guys in an email for this project. But are there any questions as of right now?
Yeah, so how long would you want that story to be if we wrote one?
I mean, if I had to guess, in order to get all of this is going to be, this is really the only project we've done over this stuff in a while. I would probably say about 2 pages, double space, 12-point font, Times New Roman, I guess, if you were going to look for a real thing, but just kind of whatever feels right. You know what I mean? Like if you write something that's just an absolute masterpiece and it's a page and a quarter, cool. You can also, I know I did this in college. One time, I think this teacher gave me a decent grade because this was high school. I typed a 20-page paper, but it was mostly just filler garbage. He gave me a good grade on it because I put in a lot of work into it, but it was not like a great paper. So focus more on the content than you would on like a specific length. If it feels like it's long enough, cool. You can also send it to me and I can give you feedback on it. if you're wondering. So I think that would maybe be the best course of action is say, I think I'm good. Mr. Schultz, what do you think? And I can either say, yeah, Connor, this looks great. Or I can say, yeah, this is a really good start. I would probably put a little bit more time and effort into this, this, and this. Okay.
So
All right.
you, so you want us to write this about like the animal's evolution, like how it changes into a different animal or like reproduces into a different animal?
Well, I mean, you can either talk about one single species and how that species changes over time, or you can talk about one species becoming two different species, okay, through speciation. I'm kind
Okay.
of leaving that up to you, all right? Essentially, what I want you guys to do with this project is just apply all of the different things that we've been talking about and hopefully learning about over the past couple of weeks, and apply them to a project. Normally, I would do some sort of quiz and assess you that way. But due to this, I obviously understand that this is weird and hard, and so we're going to try and do a different type of assessment. And I just wanted you guys to show me that you have learned stuff through some sort of project, okay? All of the different videos that we've been talking about evolution and different things with evolution, I would probably try and have different aspects of each of those videos in whatever you're doing, whether it's a story, a diagram, a presentation, okay? I would I'd try and involve aspects of all of that in there. Again, probably just the more detailed you make it, the better your grade's going to be. And if you are wondering if it's good enough, you can always email me your drafts of it and I can check it. Okay.